Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're tackling a really big one of the most persistent, most controversial conspiracy theories of the 21st century, and that's the idea that the 9/11 attacks were in fact an inside job.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with what happened on that day. The established facts. Then we'll get right into what the inside job theory actually is. From there, we'll look at the big claims versus the facts for the towers and the Pentagon. Then we'll switch gears a bit and talk about the psychology of why people believe this stuff. And finally, we'll see where this theory stands today.
All right, before we can even begin to unpack the conspiracy theories, we've got to ground ourselves in the official, undisputed account of what happened. Think of this as the foundation, right? It's the story that all the questions and all the theories ultimately spring from.
And the human cost, it was just staggering. We're talking about nearly 3,000 lives lost. That kind of national trauma, it's so profound, it just creates this fertile ground for questions, for suspicion, and for a deep need to find answers that maybe go beyond the official story.
What's just so hard to wrap your head around is how fast it all happened. The whole sequence was terrifyingly quick. In just a little over an hour, these 4 coordinated attacks completely changed the world. Now, for most people, the conclusion was clear. This was an act of foreign terrorism. But for a growing number of people, the official story of how this was even possible, well, it just didn't add up.
And that very skepticism leads us right to the heart of it all, to the core allegation that literally rose from the ashes of the attack. An allegation that didn't point the finger outward, but pointed it right back at home.
So this is it right here. This is the fundamental premise of the inside job theory. It's not about nitpicking small details. We're talking about an allegation of a massive, almost unimaginable betrayal, that the US government either let the attacks happen, or worse, orchestrated them, all to justify going to war.
Now what's interesting is that even within the theory, there are basically 2 different camps. You've got LIHO, which stands for Let It Happen on Purpose. The idea here is that the government knew the attacks were coming, but chose to do nothing. Then you've got the more extreme version, MIHO, or Made It Happen on Purpose, and that's the belief that the government actually planned and carried out the attacks themselves. It's a really important distinction to keep in mind as we start unpacking the claims.
Okay, so a huge chunk of this whole theory really zeroes in on the physics of how the Twin Towers collapsed. For proponents, what we all saw with our own eyes, it doesn't line up with the official story. So let's really dig in here and look at the claims versus what the scientific investigations actually found.
You've probably heard this one before. In fact, it might be the single most famous phrase to come out of the entire 9/11 truth movement. Jet fuel can't melt steel beams. It's a simple, really powerful question that seems to blow a huge hole in the official narrative. But what does the science have to say?
Okay, so here's the thing, and it's a really important distinction. The steel didn't have to melt. In fact, no official report ever said it did. The whole point, according to investigators, is that the intense fires weakened the steel to a critical point. It's like heating up a piece of metal until it's red hot. It doesn't have to be liquid to bend and fail under pressure. And that's exactly what they say happened.
So the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that's NIST, they did this massive, multi-year investigation. And here's what they found. Those fires weakened the steel columns. Then, the floors above the impact points started to fall. Imagine that incredible weight just slamming down, creating what they called a pancaking effect. Each floor just completely overwhelmed the one below it, all the way down. And here's the crucial part. The collapse started right there, at the impact levels, not from the bottom like you'd see in a planned demolition.
But what about World Trade Center 7? This is the building that wasn't even hit by a plane. For a lot of conspiracy theorists, this is the smoking gun. It collapsed later in the day, almost perfectly into its own footprint. So the question is, how on earth does that happen?
So the claim is pretty straightforward. Its symmetrical collapse looks exactly like a controlled demolition. Plus, there's this quote from the owner where he said, "Pull it," which many see as a dead giveaway. But the official investigation tells a different story. They found that WTC-7 took massive damage when the North Tower came down, and then it just burned, completely out of control, for 7 hours. And that "pull it" quote? Well, it turns out that's a common phrase in firefighting, and it meant pull the firefighters out, away from the building before it collapsed on them.
Okay, let's shift our focus now to the Pentagon. This is another major pillar of the inside job theory. And this one gets even more wild. It questions whether a passenger jet even hit the building at all. The argument here really hinges on the visual evidence, or lack thereof, right after the impact. Theorists look at the photos and say, hey, that hole is way too small for a Boeing 757, and where's all the wreckage? They suggest it must have been a missile. On the other hand, you have dozens of eyewitnesses who swear they saw the plane. Investigators explain that one wing hit the ground and the other was sheared off on impact, which is why the initial hole was smaller than the full wingspan. And they did recover the fuselage, the engines, and tragically the remains of the passengers. So, we've gone through some of the big whats of the theory, but that's really only half the story, isn't it? The much bigger, more interesting question is, why? Why does this theory still have such a powerful grip on so many people, even after all the official investigations and scientific reports?
Well, psychologists have a few ideas. For one, there's a deep, deep distrust in government that's always bubbling under the surface. Then, there's just our basic human need to find a simple explanation for something that's just horrifyingly chaotic and random. A secret plan, in a weird way, feels more controllable than a random act of terror. Of course, you have the internet, which just acts like a giant accelerator for these ideas. And finally, there's this thing called shifting the goalposts. You debunk one claim, and believers just move on to the next one without missing a beat.
And that brings us to today. Because even after more than 2 decades, this theory is far from gone. In fact, you could argue it's more relevant than ever. Just look at the numbers. Polls consistently show that a pretty significant chunk of the population, we're talking 15, maybe 20%, still has serious doubts or straight up believes some version of this theory. So this isn't some tiny fringe idea. It's a real persistent part of the conversation.
And what's really fascinating is that the theory isn't static. It's not stuck in 2001. It's evolved. The core idea, this concept of a secret deep state cabal pulling the strings, well, that fits perfectly into more modern conspiracy theories like QAnon. It's like the original software got a 21st century update, giving it brand new life.
So even though the theory persists, it's absolutely crucial to stack it up against the mountain of counter-evidence. I mean, we're talking about a 3-year, $20 million investigation by NIST, the official 9/11 Commission report, detailed debunkings by places like Popular Mechanics, who talked to hundreds of experts. The consensus among structural engineers and aviation experts is just overwhelming. They found zero evidence to support a controlled demolition or any government involvement.
And that really leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought, doesn't it? The legacy of the 9/11 inside job theory forces us to ask, when our own deeply held beliefs clash with a mountain of established facts, which one actually wins? It's a powerful reminder that in our modern world, sometimes what we believe can feel more real than the truth itself.